The morning mist clung to the valley like a shroud as Sarah Martinez adjusted the radio antenna one final time, her weathered hands trembling not from cold but from the weight of what she was about to broadcast. 3 years had passed since the Great Collapse, 3 years since the infected hordes had swept across America like a plague of biblical proportions, and yet here in the hidden valley of Cedar Ridge 47 souls still drew breath in defiance of a world gone mad. The radio crackled to life, its green display the only source of light in the communication bunker carved deep into the mountain. Sarah had been the town's emergency coordinator before the outbreak, a position that seemed almost quaint now as she served as the village's lifeline to whatever remained of civilization. Her daily broadcasts had grown shorter over the months, responses from the outside world dwindling to nothing, but she persisted because hope was sometimes all that stood between survival and surrender. "This is Cedar Ridge Emergency Station, day 1095 since the initial outbreak," she spoke into the microphone, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting above ground. Through the bunker's reinforced walls, she could hear the distant sounds of the morning's first skirmish, the sharp crack of Marcus Webb's hunting rifle echoing off the valley walls, followed by the inhuman shrieks of the infected as they tested the perimeter defenses once again. The creatures had found them 2 weeks ago, drawn by smoke from their forge or perhaps by the scent of livestock that still grazed in their hidden pastures. What had started as isolated encounters with lone wanderers had escalated into coordinated assaults by groups that seemed to grow larger and more aggressive with each passing day. Sarah glanced at the defensive status board, its red and green lights telling a story of mounting pressure. The east wall had been breached twice in the past week, requiring emergency repairs that depleted their precious supply of concrete and steel. The north watchtower reported movement in the treeline, dark shapes that moved with purpose rather than the aimless wandering typical of the infected. These weren't ordinary zombies, they were evolving, adapting, learning to hunt in packs like wolves. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the village's physician and their closest approximation to a scientist, had been documenting the changes in the infected for months. Her notes spoke of creatures that retained fragments of human intelligence, enough to use simple tools and coordinate attacks in ways that defied everything the early survivors had believed about the plague. The bunker's secondary radio suddenly burst to life, cutting through the static with a voice Sarah hadn't heard in over 6 months. "Cedar Ridge, this is Phoenix Base, do you copy?" The transmission was weak, distorted by atmospheric interference, but unmistakably human. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she switched frequencies, her hands moving across the controls with practiced precision. Phoenix Base had been their last confirmed contact with the outside world, a military installation somewhere in the Arizona desert that had gone silent during the winter months. "Phoenix Base, this is Cedar Ridge. We copy you barely. What's your status?" The response came fragmented, words cutting in and out like a puzzle with missing pieces. "Under siege. New variant, spreading faster than anything we've seen. Need to know if you're still maintaining defensive positions." Above ground, the sounds of conflict intensified. Marcus Webb's voice boomed across the valley, coordinating the morning defense with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to kill or be killed. "Contact on the eastern slope. Jenny, take the high ground and give us covering fire." The sharp report of Jenny Coleman's sniper rifle answered him, followed by the wet thud of a body hitting the ground. But for every infected that fell, 2 more seemed to emerge from the forest, their pale forms moving with an eerie coordination that sent chills down Sarah's spine. These weren't the shambling corpses of the early days. These were predators, and Cedar Ridge had become their prey. The radio crackled again, Phoenix Base's transmission growing stronger as if the operator was boosting the signal. "Cedar Ridge, we're tracking a massive horde moving northeast from the Colorado River. Estimated strength over 10,000, moving with purpose. They're not just wandering, they're hunting settlements. You need to evacuate immediately." Sarah's blood turned to ice as she processed the implications. 10,000 infected, moving with purpose, hunting settlements. Cedar Ridge had survived through isolation and careful resource management, but they had never faced anything close to those numbers. Their defensive walls, their carefully planned fallback positions, their precious stockpiles of ammunition, none of it would matter against a horde of that magnitude. The bunker's main door burst open, and Tom Bradley, the village's de facto leader, stumbled inside, his face grim with the weight of impossible decisions. "Sarah, we've got a problem. The scouts report movement on all sides. We're surrounded." The pre-dawn darkness provided little comfort as Dr. Elena Vasquez crouched behind the eastern barricade, her medical bag clutched tightly against her chest while she watched Marcus Webb apply field dressings to Jenny Coleman's shoulder. The sniper had taken shrapnel from an improvised explosive device. a crude but effective bomb that had detonated when she'd attempted to clear infected from the treeline. The implications of that explosion sent ice through Elena's veins, because zombies didn't build bombs, and yet the evidence lay scattered across the forest floor in twisted metal and chemical residue. Jenny winced as Marcus tightened the bandage, her usually steady hands trembling with pain and something deeper, the fear that came with witnessing the impossible. "They're learning," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant moaning that echoed through the valley like a funeral dirge. "That wasn't random. They waited until I was in position, then triggered the device remotely." Elena nodded grimly, her scientific mind racing through the implications while her hands continued their practiced work of treating the wounded. Over the past week, she had documented 17 separate incidents that defied everything they thought they knew about the infected. Zombies using tools was disturbing enough, but coordinated ambushes, trap setting, and now remote detonation of explosives suggested cognitive abilities that should have been impossible given the neurological damage caused by the plague. She had spent countless hours studying tissue samples from fallen infected, watching the virus consume neural pathways while somehow preserving others. The pattern was becoming clear. The infection wasn't just destroying the brain, it was rewiring it, creating something new and terrifyingly intelligent. Tom Bradley's voice crackled through the radio, urgent and strained. "All units, we've got movement on the South Ridge. They're not attacking, they're watching." Elena felt her blood chill as she processed the implications. The infected had never shown strategic patience before, never demonstrated the ability to conduct reconnaissance or gather intelligence. They had always been driven by immediate hunger, attacking with relentless but predictable aggression. This new behavior suggested a level of planning that made their current defensive strategies obsolete. Marcus grabbed his rifle and moved toward the observation post, his movements fluid and professional despite the exhaustion that lined his weathered face. As the village's former sheriff, he had adapted to their new reality better than most, but even he seemed shaken by the evolving threat. The radio suddenly erupted with panicked voices from the North Watchtower. "Contact. Multiple contacts approaching from the creek bed, but they're not advancing. They're organizing." Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she processed the reports flowing in from all defensive positions. The infected weren't just surrounding Cedar Ridge anymore. They were deploying in coordinated formations, establishing overwatch positions, and demonstrating tactical awareness that defied every assumption about their capabilities. Through her binoculars, she could see dark figures moving among the trees with purpose, their movements too deliberate to be accidental. Some carried makeshift weapons fashioned from debris, while others seemed to be directing the movements of their companions through gestures and vocalizations that almost resembled communication. The breakthrough came when young Tommy Martinez, Sarah's nephew, came running from the communications bunker with a recording device clutched in his trembling hands. "Aunt Sarah told me to bring this to you," he gasped, his teenage voice cracking with fear and excitement. "She's been monitoring their radio frequencies. They're using our own equipment against us." Elena's mind reeled as she listened to the static-filled recording, picking out fragments of human speech corrupted by the infection but still intelligible. The voices spoke in broken sentences, coordinating movements and sharing information about defensive positions with an efficiency that made her stomach turn. They weren't just mindless predators anymore, they were becoming something that retained fragments of human intelligence while losing everything that made them human. The implications hit her like a physical blow. If the infected could communicate, coordinate, and learn from their failures, then every defensive strategy Cedar Ridge had developed was based on false assumptions. Their walls had been built to contain mindless attackers, their fallback positions designed to exploit predictable behavior patterns. But if the infected could adapt, plan, and coordinate their attacks, then survival would require completely rethinking their approach to defense. Elena found herself staring at the radio device, listening to the corrupted voices planning their community's destruction with the detached efficiency of military strategists. The infection had created something new, a hybrid intelligence that combined human cognitive abilities with the relentless hunger of the undead. As if summoned by her thoughts, a new voice cut through the static, clearer than the others and infinitely more chilling. "We know you're listening," it said, the words distorted but unmistakably directed at them. "We know where you are. We know how many you are. And we're coming for all of you." The transmission ended with a sound that might have been laughter, if laughter could come from a throat that had forgotten how to be human. The emergency council meeting convened in the old schoolhouse basement, its concrete walls providing both physical protection and psychological comfort as the 47 survivors of Cedar Ridge faced their darkest hour. Tom Bradley stood at the head of the room, his weathered face illuminated by the harsh glow of battery-powered lanterns, while behind him a hand-drawn map of their valley showed defensive positions marked in red ink, positions that no longer seemed adequate against an enemy that could think, plan, and communicate. The silence stretched like a taut wire as everyone processed the recordings Elena had shared, the corrupted voices of the infected demonstrating an intelligence that rendered their entire survival strategy obsolete. Sarah Martinez sat in the front row, her radio operator's headset still around her neck, her face pale with the weight of knowledge that their sanctuary had become a trap. "We have 3 choices," Tom began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "We can fortify and hope our walls hold against whatever's coming. We can attempt to break through their lines and find another sanctuary. Or we can negotiate." The last word hung in the air like a blasphemy, because negotiating with the infected had been unthinkable until they learned the creatures could speak. Marcus Webb shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hunting rifle propped against the wall but within easy reach. As their primary defender, he had seen the evidence firsthand. Infected that set traps, coordinated attacks, and now demonstrated the ability to conduct psychological warfare. The thought of treating them as anything other than mindless predators went against every instinct he had developed over 3 years of survival. The debate that followed revealed fractures in their community that had been hidden by the shared struggle for survival. Father Miguel Santos, the village's spiritual leader, argued for attempting communication with the infected, believing that any retained humanity could be reached through compassion and understanding. His words were met with angry opposition from the families who had lost loved ones to the plague, their grief and rage making compromise impossible. Jenny Coleman, despite her wounded shoulder, spoke with the authority of someone who had looked death in the face and survived. "They're not human anymore," she said, her voice cutting through the arguments. "Whatever they were, whatever they remember, they're predators now. And we're prey." The discussion was interrupted by Tommy Martinez bursting through the basement door, his teenage face flushed with excitement and terror. "They're moving," he gasped, having run from the communications bunker where he had been monitoring the infected's radio chatter. "The voices on the radio, they're talking about timing, about waiting for something. And there's more coming from the south." Elena immediately began questioning him about the intercepted communications, her scientific mind trying to extract useful intelligence from fragments of corrupted speech. The infected were using code words, references to locations and timing that suggested a level of strategic planning that made their current defensive preparations seem pathetically inadequate. Tom made the decision that would define their community's fate. "We send out a reconnaissance team," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of leadership earned through crisis. "We need to know what we're facing, how many, and what their capabilities are. Knowledge is our only advantage now." The volunteers stepped forward immediately. Marcus with his tactical experience, Jenny despite her injury, and surprisingly, Dr. Vasquez, whose medical knowledge might prove crucial in understanding their enemy's capabilities. The team would leave at dawn, using the old hunting trails that wound through the mountains, carrying radio equipment to maintain contact and emergency supplies in case they couldn't return. The night before the reconnaissance mission, Cedar Ridge transformed into a fortress of desperate activity. Every able-bodied resident worked to reinforce defensive positions, knowing that the next attack might be their last. Children helped adults stack sandbags and fill ammunition magazines, their young faces serious with the weight of responsibility that had been thrust upon them. The village's workshop hummed with activity as skilled craftsmen converted farming tools into weapons and fashioned crude explosives from fertilizer and household chemicals. They had learned to create improvised devices from the infected's own tactics, though the irony of adopting their enemy's methods was not lost on anyone. As dawn approached, the reconnaissance team made their final preparations, checking equipment and reviewing maps by the light of shielded lanterns. The infected's radio chatter had grown more frequent during the night, their corrupted voices coordinating movements with an efficiency that suggested military-level organization. Elena packed her medical kit alongside recording equipment, determined to document whatever they discovered about the infection's evolution. Marcus checked his weapons one final time, his experienced hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to kill or be killed. Jenny adjusted her rifle sling to accommodate her wounded shoulder, her sniper's eyes already scanning the treeline for threats. The team departed as the first rays of sunlight painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, their footsteps muffled by morning mist that clung to the ground like a burial shroud. Behind them, Cedar Ridge continued its frantic preparations, 44 souls working against time to prepare for a siege that might determine the fate of human resistance in their corner of the world. The reconnaissance team had been gone for 6 hours when the ground beneath Cedar Ridge began to tremble with an ominous rhythm that seemed to pulse from the earth itself. Sarah Martinez felt it first in the communications bunker, a subtle vibration that traveled through the concrete floor and into her bones, disrupting radio signals and causing equipment to rattle on their shelves. At first, she dismissed it as distant machinery or perhaps blasting from the old quarry miles away, but the pattern was too regular, too purposeful to be mechanical. The tremors came in waves, each one stronger than the last, as if something massive was moving through the underground passages that honeycombed the mountain beneath their feet. Tommy Martinez was the first to connect the vibrations with the village's history, his teenage mind recalling stories his grandfather had told about the old copper mines that had once made Cedar Ridge a thriving industrial community. The mines had been abandoned for decades, their entrances sealed with concrete and steel, but the tunnels themselves stretched for miles beneath the valley, creating a vast network of passages that connected every building in the village to the surrounding wilderness. His grandfather had worked those tunnels as a young man, mapping their layouts and understanding their dangers, knowledge that had seemed irrelevant until the infected began demonstrating strategic intelligence. Now, as the tremors grew stronger, Tommy realized that their carefully constructed defenses might be worthless if the enemy could approach from below. The discovery came when Mrs. Henderson, the village librarian, noticed water seeping through cracks in her basement floor, water that carried a metallic taste and an odor that made her stomach turn. She had lived in Cedar Ridge for 40 years, through mining accidents and floods, and she knew that underground water didn't move like this, didn't carry sounds like the distant scratching and scraping that echoed through the walls. When she called Tom Bradley to investigate, they found fresh gouges in the concrete, claw marks that suggested something had been testing the barriers between the tunnels and the occupied spaces above. The infected had found their way into the old mine shafts, and they were systematically exploring every passage, every connection, every possible entry point into the village's supposedly secure perimeter. The implications hit the community like a physical blow. Every basement, every storm drain, every foundation that had been built over the old mining infrastructure was potentially compromised. Their defensive walls, their carefully planned kill zones, their ammunition stockpiles, all of it assumed that attacks would come from above ground, from directions they could see and prepare for. But if the infected could move freely through the underground network, they could emerge anywhere, anytime, turning the village's own infrastructure against them. Elena's medical training included emergency response protocols, and she immediately began calculating the defensive implications of a multi-vector attack that could emerge from sewers, basements, and utility tunnels simultaneously. The evacuation of vulnerable positions began immediately, with families relocating from ground-floor homes to upper stories and the community's emergency supplies being redistributed to locations that couldn't be accessed from below. But the process revealed how dependent they had become on their underground infrastructure. The water pumps, electrical systems, and food storage that kept the village functioning were all located in basements and utility spaces that were now potential breach points. Tom Bradley found himself facing the possibility that their sanctuary had become a trap, with the infected using the village's own mining history as a weapon against them. The first breakthrough came at sunset, when the concrete floor of the old general store cracked with a sound like thunder, releasing a cloud of dust and the unmistakable stench of decay. The infected emerged with coordinated precision, their pale forms moving through the opening like water flowing uphill, their movements suggesting they had mapped every passage and planned every emergence point. But this wasn't a random attack, it was a probe, a test of the village's response capabilities that would inform a larger assault. The creatures observed the defensive response, noted the positions of armed villagers, and then retreated back into the tunnels before significant casualties could be inflicted on either side. The psychological impact was devastating. The villagers had grown accustomed to defending walls and maintaining perimeters, but now they faced an enemy that could appear anywhere, anytime, using their own infrastructure against them. Children were relocated to upper floors, guards were posted at every basement entrance, and the community's precious ammunition was redistributed to cover threats that could emerge from any direction. The infected had transformed Cedar Ridge from a fortress into a maze, where every door, every staircase, every room could become a battleground without warning. As night fell, the sounds from below grew louder, scratching, scraping, and what might have been voices coordinating movements through the darkness. The reconnaissance team was still missing, the radio channels filled with static and the corrupted communications of the infected. Cedar Ridge had become an island surrounded by enemies who moved through the earth itself, turning the village's own history into a weapon that threatened to destroy everything they had built. The radio transmission arrived at dawn on the third day after the reconnaissance team's departure, crackling through the static with a human voice that wasn't corrupted by infection. Sarah Martinez nearly dropped her coffee as she lunged for the communication equipment, her heart hammering with hope and fear in equal measure. "Cedar Ridge, this is Iron Mountain Base, do you copy?" The voice was female, professional, with the clipped efficiency of military training. Sarah's hands trembled as she adjusted the frequency, fighting through atmospheric interference to maintain the connection that might represent their salvation or their doom. "Iron Mountain Base, this is Cedar Ridge. We copy you clearly. What's your status and location?" The response came with coordinates that placed Iron Mountain Base approximately 60 miles northeast, in the rugged terrain that had once been state parkland. Captain Lisa Chin identified herself as the commanding officer of a joint military-civilian installation that had been monitoring radio traffic throughout the region, tracking survivor communities and coordinating mutual aid when possible. Her voice carried the weight of authority and exhaustion, the sound of someone who had learned to make impossible decisions in a world where every choice carried life or death consequences. "We've been tracking infected movement patterns in your area. You're about to be hit by something bigger than anything you've faced before." The intelligence Captain Chin shared painted a picture of regional catastrophe that made Cedar Ridge's situation even more desperate. The infected weren't just evolving, they were migrating, following some instinct or intelligence that drove them to consolidate into massive hordes that swept across the landscape like biblical plagues. Iron Mountain Base had survived through mobility and superior firepower, using armored vehicles and coordinated air support to stay ahead of the advancing swarms. But their resources were finite, their fuel supplies dwindling, and they faced the same strategic dilemma that confronted every survivor community: fight alone and die, or risk everything on uncertain alliances. The proposal Captain Chin offered was as dangerous as it was necessary. Iron Mountain Base would provide tactical support, medical supplies, and ammunition in exchange for Cedar Ridge's agricultural output and technical expertise. Dr. Vasquez's medical knowledge was particularly valuable, as was Tommy Martinez's understanding of the local mining infrastructure. But the alliance would require Cedar Ridge to open their defensive perimeter to outside personnel, trusting strangers with their lives and their carefully hoarded resources. The debate that followed split the community along lines that had been forming since the crisis began, with some arguing for accepting any help available while others insisted that outsiders would only bring more danger. The decision became urgent when Captain Chen's intelligence proved accurate. The infected were indeed massing for a major assault, but they weren't just targeting Cedar Ridge, they were coordinating attacks against multiple survivor communities simultaneously, as if following some overarching strategy that transcended individual hunger. The radio channels filled with distress calls from settlements throughout the region, communities that had survived for years suddenly finding themselves overwhelmed by coordinated assaults that demonstrated tactical sophistication. Iron Mountain Base was already responding to 3 separate emergency calls, their resources stretched thin but their commitment to mutual aid absolute. Tom Bradley made the decision that would define their community's future, accepting the alliance despite the risks and the internal opposition it generated. The first Iron Mountain personnel arrived within hours, a small advance team led by Sergeant Rodriguez who brought medical supplies, communications equipment, and intelligence that changed everything Cedar Ridge thought they knew about their situation. The infected weren't just randomly aggressive, they were being directed by something that retained enough human intelligence to conduct strategic planning on a regional scale. The controller zombie that Dr. Vasquez had theorized about wasn't just coordinating local attacks. It was orchestrating a campaign to eliminate all human resistance in the area. The alliance brought immediate benefits and unexpected complications. Iron Mountain's medical supplies allowed Elena to properly treat Jenny Coleman's infected shoulder wound, while their communications equipment revealed the full scope of the infected's radio chatter. But the new personnel also brought different survival philosophies, different approaches to resource management, and different ideas about acceptable risk. Sergeant Rodriguez clashed with Marcus Webb over defensive priorities, while Captain Chen's remote tactical guidance sometimes contradicted Tom Bradley's local knowledge. The integration of 2 distinct survival cultures created friction even as it enhanced their capabilities. The situation reached a breaking point when the missing reconnaissance team finally made contact, their radio transmission filled with static and panic. Marcus Webb's voice cut through the interference, reporting that they had discovered the source of the infected's coordination. A massive installation built into an old military bunker where hundreds of infected had gathered around what appeared to be a central controlling intelligence. The reconnaissance team was trapped, surrounded by thousands of infected, but they had gathered intelligence that could change the entire strategic situation. The infected weren't just evolving randomly, they were being systematically upgraded by something that understood human military tactics and was using that knowledge to eliminate all resistance. The rescue mission would require everything both communities could contribute, combining Cedar Ridge's local knowledge with Iron Mountain's tactical expertise in a desperate gambit to save their people and strike at the heart of the infected's command structure. The assault began at 3:47 a.m. with a sound like thunder rolling through the earth itself, as thousands of infected emerged simultaneously from every underground passage, storm drain, and forgotten mine shaft beneath Cedar Ridge. The coordinated breach shattered the illusion of safety that had sustained the community through 3 years of careful survival, transforming their sanctuary into a battlefield where every room, every corridor, every staircase became a potential killing ground. Sarah Martinez barely escaped the communications bunker as infected poured through cracks in the concrete foundation, their pale forms moving with the fluid coordination of a military unit executing a precisely planned assault. The emergency lighting flickered and died as creatures severed power cables with deliberate precision, plunging the village into darkness broken only by muzzle flashes and the eerie phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from the infected themselves. Tom Bradley's voice cut through the chaos on the emergency radio frequency, coordinating a fighting withdrawal that had been planned but never truly believed necessary. All units, execute Omega Protocol. Fall back to secondary positions, maintain communication, watch for underground emergence. The Omega Protocol represented their worst-case scenario, the complete abandonment of the outer defensive perimeter and consolidation into the village's most defensible structures. But even those preparations seemed inadequate against an enemy that could appear anywhere, anytime, using the village's own infrastructure as a weapon. The infected had transformed Cedar Ridge from a fortress into a maze where every shadow could conceal death, every door could open onto nightmare. Jenny Coleman's sniper position in the old grain silo became a beacon of resistance as she methodically eliminated infected commanders, the creatures whose actions suggested they were coordinating the assault. Her wounded shoulder screamed with pain, but her shots remained precise, each bullet finding its mark with the deadly accuracy that had kept Cedar Ridge's defenders alive for 3 years. Through her scope, she could see the horrifying intelligence behind the attack, infected using hand signals, coordinating flanking maneuvers, and adapting their tactics in real time as they encountered resistance. These weren't the mindless zombies of the early days, they were predators that had learned to hunt with the efficiency of apex predators. The breaking point came when the infected breached the schoolhouse basement where the community's children had been sheltered. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly librarian, stood alone against a tide of creatures that poured through the ventilation system, her hunting rifle steady despite the arthritis that gnarled her fingers. She had taught half the village to read, had been the keeper of their collective memory, and now she became their last line of defense against monsters that sought to devour everything human. Her final transmission was calm, almost peaceful. Tell the children I'm sorry. Tell them to remember us. The explosion that followed collapsed the entire basement, sealing the breach but taking with it the woman who had been the heart of their community's culture. Dr. Elena Vasquez found herself treating wounded defenders in the old church, the sacred space transformed into a field hospital where the boundary between life and death blurred with each passing moment. Her medical supplies, augmented by Iron Mountain's contributions, were rapidly depleting as the casualties mounted. But she had also discovered something crucial in the blood samples she had taken from fallen infected, a pattern in their neural activity that suggested vulnerability, a frequency that seemed to disrupt their coordination. The discovery offered hope, but implementing it would require technology and time they didn't have while fighting for their lives. The alliance with Iron Mountain Base proved its worth when Captain Chen's tactical support arrived in the form of coordinated artillery strikes that disrupted the infected's assault patterns. The explosions lit up the night like artificial sunrise, momentarily stunning the creatures and giving the defenders precious seconds to regroup and resupply. But the infected adapted quickly, dispersing to minimize casualties and using the underground tunnels to avoid the bombardment. Sergeant Rodriguez led a counterattack that retook the communications bunker, but the cost was measured in lives that Cedar Ridge could not afford to lose. The night's darkest moment came when the infected breached the primary ammunition depot, their coordinated assault suggesting they understood the strategic importance of denying the defenders their firepower. Marcus Webb led a desperate charge to retake the position, his combat experience and intimate knowledge of the village's layout allowing him to outmaneuver creatures that seemed to anticipate every defensive move. The battle for the depot became a microcosm of the larger conflict. Humans fighting with courage and desperation against an enemy that combined relentless hunger with tactical sophistication. As dawn approached, Cedar Ridge had been transformed from a thriving community into a collection of isolated strongpoints, each one defending against attacks that could come from any direction. The infected had achieved their tactical objective of fragmenting the defense, but they had also revealed the full scope of their capabilities. The survivors now understood exactly what they were facing. Not just evolved zombies, but a new form of intelligence that had learned to wage war with the efficiency of human military forces while retaining the relentless hunger that made them truly terrifying. The morning after the devastating assault revealed a transformed battlefield where the infected had made a critical mistake that would ultimately seal their fate. Dr. Elena Vasquez discovered it first as she moved between the scattered defensive positions, treating wounded survivors and collecting tissue samples from the fallen creatures that littered Cedar Ridge's streets. The infected had evolved beyond their original parameters, their enhanced intelligence coming at a cost that their controlling entity hadn't anticipated. The neural modifications that allowed them to coordinate and communicate had also made them vulnerable to specific electromagnetic frequencies, creating a weakness that could be exploited if the survivors had the knowledge and equipment to do so. The breakthrough came when Elena analyzed blood samples from the infected commanders that Jenny Coleman had eliminated during the night assault. Under her improvised laboratory conditions in the church basement, she discovered that the creatures' enhanced neural networks operated on a narrow frequency band that synchronized their movements and communication. The controlling intelligence had essentially created a biological radio network, but like any communication system, it could be jammed, disrupted, or even hijacked with the right approach. The discovery sent shockwaves through the surviving defenders, offering hope where none had existed just hours before. Tommy Martinez proved instrumental in understanding the technical implications of Elena's discovery. His knowledge of the old mining equipment included industrial radio systems that had been used for underground communication, devices powerful enough to broadcast on the frequencies that controlled the infected's neural networks. The equipment was buried in the collapsed sections of the mine complex, but it could be recovered if they could mount an expedition into the very tunnels the infected were using as their base of operations. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. They would need to enter the enemy's domain to acquire the weapons that could defeat them. Captain Chen's tactical analysis, transmitted through the fragmented communication network that Iron Mountain had established, confirmed Elena's findings from a military perspective. The infected's coordination was their greatest strength but also their most exploitable weakness. If the neural network could be disrupted on a large scale, the creatures would revert to their original mindless state, becoming manageable through conventional defensive tactics. But the window of opportunity was narrow. The controlling intelligence was already adapting, modifying the infected's neural patterns to compensate for their newfound vulnerability. The rescue mission to retrieve Marcus Webb's reconnaissance team became the test case for the new strategy. The team had been trapped for 4 days in the old military bunker, surrounded by thousands of infected but somehow still alive and transmitting intelligence about the controlling entity's operations. Their reports described a massive biological network where hundreds of infected served as nodes in a living computer system, processing information and coordinating regional attacks against survivor communities. The controlling intelligence wasn't just one creature. It was a collective consciousness that had emerged from the infected's evolved neural networks. The assault team that formed to test Elena's discovery represented the best of both communities working in desperate coordination. Jenny Coleman would provide sniper support despite her wounded shoulder, while Sergeant Rodriguez led the tactical approach using modified radio equipment to disrupt the infected's coordination. Tom Bradley insisted on participating despite his age and lack of combat experience, arguing that his knowledge of the local terrain was irreplaceable. The team carried improvised electromagnetic pulse devices cobbled together from mining equipment and Iron Mountain's military electronics, weapons that had never been tested but represented their only hope of success. The descent into the mine complex revealed the true scope of the infected's transformation. The tunnels had been modified into a vast organic network, with infected creatures serving as living cables that transmitted neural signals throughout the underground system. The walls themselves pulsed with a rhythm that matched the creature's coordination, suggesting that the infection had evolved beyond individual organisms into something resembling a massive biological computer. The controlling intelligence had literally rewired the mountain's infrastructure, turning Cedar Ridge's own mining history into the foundation for a new form of collective consciousness. The first test of the electromagnetic disruption occurred when the assault team encountered a group of infected commanders coordinating an attack on the surface. Elena activated the improvised pulse device, and the effect was immediate and devastating. The creatures collapsed as their neural networks overloaded, their coordination shattered and their enhanced intelligence temporarily disabled. But the victory was short-lived as backup systems activated, rerouting the network around the disrupted nodes and adapting the frequency patterns to resist further interference. The controlling intelligence was learning from each attack, evolving its defenses in real time. The discovery of the network's adaptive capabilities forced a fundamental change in strategy. Single-point attacks would be ineffective against a system that could learn and adapt. The only way to permanently disrupt the infected's coordination would be to overload the entire network simultaneously, creating a cascade failure that would destroy the collective intelligence before it could adapt. Such an assault would require coordinating electromagnetic pulses from multiple locations, timing them precisely to prevent the network from compensating. The mission to rescue Marcus Webb's team had become something far more significant, a test run for an operation that could determine the fate of human resistance throughout the entire region. The final assault began at dawn on the 7th day, with the combined forces of Cedar Ridge and Iron Mountain Base executing a coordinated strike that would either liberate the region from the infected's control or mark the end of organized human resistance. Dr. Elena Vasquez had spent the night calibrating electromagnetic pulse devices at 7 strategic locations throughout the mountain complex, each one positioned to create a cascade failure that would overload the infected's neural network before it could adapt. The timing had to be perfect. A synchronized pulse that would hit every node simultaneously, denying the controlling intelligence the precious seconds it needed to reroute around damaged sections. Marcus Webb's voice crackled through the radio as his rescued reconnaissance team took position at the primary transmission site deep within the old military bunker. 4 days of captivity had left them weakened but not broken, and their intelligence about the controlling entity's location had made the entire operation possible. "Target acquired," Marcus reported, his voice steady despite the thousands of infected that surrounded their position. "The core intelligence is directly below us, maybe 50 feet down. It's massive, bigger than anything we imagined." The description he provided painted a picture of biological horror that challenged every assumption about the infection's evolution. The controlling intelligence had grown beyond individual consciousness into something resembling a living supercomputer, its mass filling an entire chamber carved from solid rock. Infected creatures served as living processors, their enhanced neural networks wired together through organic cables that pulsed with electrical activity. The entity communicated through frequencies that human ears couldn't detect, coordinating attacks across hundreds of miles while simultaneously adapting its defensive strategies to counter every human tactical innovation. It had become evolution's answer to human intelligence, a collective consciousness that combined the best aspects of individual thinking with the power of distributed processing. Captain Chen's artillery support began precisely at 0600 hours, the explosions serving as both distraction and signal for the electromagnetic assault to commence. The infected responded with terrifying coordination, emerging from hidden positions throughout the mountain complex to defend their controlling intelligence with suicidal determination. But the creature's enhanced capabilities had become their weakness. Their dependence on the neural network meant that disrupting their communication would reduce them to the mindless zombies they had once been. Jenny Coleman's sniper rifle spoke from her position overlooking the primary access tunnel, each shot eliminating infected commanders whose destruction would disrupt local coordination nodes. Her wounded shoulder had healed enough to allow precise shooting, and her intimate knowledge of the infected's behavioral patterns made her devastatingly effective. Through her scope, she could see the moment when Elena's electromagnetic pulse hit the first network node, infected creatures suddenly stumbling as their coordination dissolved, their movements becoming erratic and uncontrolled. The cascade began slowly, then accelerated as each disrupted node caused failures in adjacent sections of the network. Tom Bradley watched from the command post as status lights indicated successful pulse detonations throughout the mountain complex, each one representing a section of the controlling intelligence's consciousness being permanently severed. The infected's responses became increasingly desperate as their coordination failed, individual creatures reverting to basic hunger-driven behavior that made them manageable through conventional tactics. But the controlling intelligence had one final adaptation, a desperate gambit that threatened to turn victory into catastrophe. As its distributed consciousness collapsed, it began consolidating its remaining neural capacity into a smaller, more concentrated form, sacrificing coordination for raw processing power that could survive the electromagnetic assault. The infected throughout the region suddenly went berserk, attacking everything in sight with mindless ferocity as their controlling intelligence withdrew into its core stronghold. Elena's final pulse device was positioned directly above the controlling intelligence's main chamber, a massive electromagnetic bomb that would either destroy the entity completely or exhaust their last hope of victory. The detonation required manual activation from within the chamber itself, a suicide mission that would expose whoever triggered it to lethal levels of electromagnetic radiation. Tommy Martinez volunteered without hesitation, his young face calm with the certainty that some sacrifices were necessary for the greater good. The explosion that followed lit up the mountain like an artificial sun, electromagnetic energy cascading through every tunnel and passage as the controlling intelligence's final stronghold was overwhelmed by forces it couldn't adapt to fast enough. The infected throughout the region collapsed as their neural networks overloaded, 3 years of evolutionary adaptation undone in a matter of seconds. Tommy's sacrifice had broken the back of the collective consciousness that had threatened to eliminate all human resistance in the area. In the aftermath, as Cedar Ridge began the long process of rebuilding and recovery, the survivors understood that they had witnessed something unprecedented in human history, the emergence and defeat of a new form of intelligence that had challenged humanity's dominance through evolution rather than technology. The infected still existed in isolated pockets, but without their controlling consciousness, they had reverted to manageable threats that could be dealt with through conventional means. Cedar Ridge had not just survived, it had struck a blow for human resistance that would echo throughout the region, proving that determination, sacrifice, and scientific innovation could triumph even against evolution itself.